Today's video topic is, was the Reconquista of Spain actually a reconquest? Just to clarify some background, Spain in the Middle Ages, Christian Spain, was a Visigothic kingdom in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire. In the early decades of the 8th century, Spain was conquered by the Muslims, kind of the last stretch of the great early Arab conquests. Spain was almost entirely conquered. There was a small group of Christians who then kind of retreated to the mountainous northern regions and formed what is called the Kingdom of Asturias. And from there, they began this long but steady process of reconquering the peninsula from the Muslims, and this is known as the Reconquista. Some people don't like this terminology. The objection you'll hear is, okay, well, this could not have been a reconquest because the Muslim conquerors, the Arabs, they destroyed the original Visigothic kingdom, and something new was established in the north, the Kingdom of Asturias, and it is from the Kingdom of Asturias that these new Christian kingdoms evolved, and it was these new political entities that conquered Spain from the Muslims. So the Reconquista was in fact just another conquest of Spain. Okay, so that's the thinking. That's the objection you'll hear sometimes, when discussion comes up of the Reconquista and medieval Spain. And I'll start off just by saying, okay, this is debatable. I guess we could talk about, was this a reconquest? Was this not? I would say that overall it's just not important. The debate itself is unimportant because when you're looking at history, when you're trying to understand the medieval world, what you're doing is you're taking a look at the peoples, the societies, the kingdoms that dominated the period, and you're trying to understand their perspective. And we do have to admit that from very early on, the Christians of Spain had this concept. They understood themselves to be engaged in a reconquest. If we look at chronicles, documents that were created by medieval Spanish Christians, this is what they talk about. They do talk about this. And by the time we get to the 9th century, we have some of our earliest source material, this chronicle of Alfonso III. Alfonso III of Asturias was an important ruler from one of these early Christian kingdoms. And this chronicle we have definitely includes language of reconquest, this concept of Reconquista. And again, you just find it all through the history. Now, if you guys want to read some early source material, just some easily accessible source material from the Christian perspective and from the Muslim perspective during this period, the early period of the Reconquista, there are a few examples in this book right here. This is widely available. You guys can get this for cheap on Amazon. I'm sure it's used as a textbook in college courses that deal with medieval Spain, but it's called Medieval Iberia, Readings from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish Sources. It's got an excerpt from the Chronicle of Alfonso III in here on page 39. So other stuff in there similar to that. There's a source material from all through the Reconquista period in here that you guys can take a look at. And there's other stuff available too. There's good collections of source material out there. I'll put some more in the description box below. But so we do have to acknowledge that this is the worldview. This is the perspective that the Christians had. And so if we do want to understand, this period, if we want to understand the Christian perspective, we do have to acknowledge the fact that they viewed what they were doing as this reconquest, and they held on to this idea for a long time. It's actually kind of striking how enduring this concept was. Now, this does not mean that this was the only conflict going on in medieval Spain. The warfare between the Christians and the Muslims was not the only thing happening. The Christian kingdoms were competing with each other and fighting with each other at times. The various Muslim powers were fighting with each other, even when all of the Muslim territory was under single rule. like when the Emir of Cordoba ruled everything, or the Caliph of Cordoba ruled everything, there was still internal conflict. There were factions. There was civil war. We have this thing called the Great Berber Uprising, which happened not long after the early Muslim conquest of Spain. The Berbers, who were one of the main groups that helped the Arabs to conquer Spain, were always kind of treated as sort of a second-rate warrior aristocracy. The Arabs sort of reserved the top spots for themselves. And I'm simplifying the politics. This is complicated, a lot of internal tribal and factional conflict. But just to simplify it, what was going on was that the upper crust Arab elite sort of excluded the more numerous Berber elite, kind of put them at a second-rate position. And at a certain point, fairly early on, in fact, the Berbers rose up against that and tried to overthrow the Arabs. So this was the Great Berber Uprising. We have all sorts of stuff like this. So all kinds of conflict was going on, within the Christian territories, within the Muslim territories. There were alliances made across these religious divides as well. For example, El Cid, at one point, he, with the King of Castile, went to defend a Muslim territory, Zaragoza, from the Christian King of Aragon, because Zaragoza was paying tribute to the King of Castile. So the Castilians were fighting with the Aragonese over who was going to gain tribute from this one wealthy Muslim city. So this kind of thing went on. You've got all kinds of internal conflicts. But the fact that this was happening doesn't detract from the fact that there was this broader umbrella conflict, this broader struggle, this more general struggle between Islam and Christianity for control of the peninsula. A lot of this has to do with the fact that during the Middle Ages, identity was very deeply defined by religion. So, you might have been a Castilian, or you might have been Aragonese, or, whatever Christian area you came from, but you were a Christian, and so this did take precedence. Same for the Muslims. In fact, we have a famous example of the various Muslim powers in the south. At times, they would call on aid from the Muslims in North Africa to help them against the Christians. I believe it was the Emir of Sevilla, one of these Muslim city-states in the south of Spain. He had this famous quote where he said he would prefer to herd camels for the Emir of Morocco rather than tend swine for the King of Castile. Okay, so what he was making a statement of religious loyalty there, because often it was very painful, or it was not preferable for the Muslim rulers of these various Muslim city-states to let the North Africans come in, because then they would have to acknowledge that the North African power was now their overlord. So the Almohads, the Almoravids, these various Berber North African powers would then come to dominate the Muslim portions of Spain. And at best, the Muslim emirs of these Muslim cities would then become sort of the vassals to the North Africans. So this was not pleasant often, but at the end of the day, they did prefer that this territory would be ruled by Muslims. And you get a similar attitude with the Christians. The Christians might fight with each other, but at the end of the day, they would work together to fight the Muslims in most cases. An example of this we can see is that the Christian powers, at a certain point, especially by the time we get into the 12th and 13th centuries, when they really have conquered a lot of territory from the Muslims, they start to make deals with each other about who's going to get what land in the Muslim south. So let's say the King of Portugal, the King of Castile, the King of Aragon, sort of the three big Christian powers. Once we're into the High Middle Ages, they would kind of divvy up the Muslim territories that still had to be conquered and say, okay, well, you'll get this, we'll get this, and the King of Portugal will get this, that kind of thing. And again, this is a manifestation of the reality that this religious divide was ultimately the more important divide at the end of the day. This is the thing that was more definitive. Bernard Wiley, in his very good book, The Contest of Christian and Muslim Spain, he actually says this early in the book. He says, the most important divisions in medieval Spain were Christian, Muslim, Jew. Beyond that, all other divisions were insignificant by comparison. So they were still, there were meaningful divisions still. Were you a Castilian? Were you Aragonese? Were you from Cordoba? Whatever. I mean, these things did count. But what Riley is saying there is that at the end of the day, this was the broader division. This was the more fundamental division. But then just to return to this whole issue of, was the Reconquista actually a reconquest? I think it's perfectly easy to argue that it was, because if we look at the Kingdom of Asturias, Pelayo, who founded the Kingdom of Asturias in the aftermath of the Arab conquest, he founds this tiny kingdom in the northern mountains of Spain. He's a Visigothic nobleman. He gathers around himself other refugee Visigothic noblemen. There are some scholars who think it was probably a mixture of Visigothic noblemen and other Christians who, were capable warriors. But anyway, there is this initial basis. Early on, we do have a pool of the Visigothic nobility who are heavily involved in this initial, Reconquista thing, as that's kind of what it's beginning to be. And this would lead us to believe that there's a good chance that many of the Christian kings who later came to dominate Spain probably had Visigothic background, back in their genetic heritage. So we could say that this was in some ways, the remnant of what had been the Visigothic kingdom reasserting itself. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. Again, there's plenty of room to debate and discuss it, but that possibility, that whole line of argument is there. And on top of that, we have to ask ourselves, what did the Christians really mean when they were talking about reconquest, when they were talking about this idea of Reconquista? Were they really just talking about the old Visigothic power structure? I would say no, they really weren't. I mean, that was one aspect of it. In most of the early documents about where they're talking about these ideas, they do sort of mention the old Visigothic state and kind of talk about, a connection to that. And also the Visigothic law code continued to be important to the Christians for many centuries after the Arab conquest. But really, what this was about was religion for them. Their big problem with the Muslim conquerors was the fact that they were not Christian. This was, in an age when religion had such a crucial element to one's identity. The fact that this non-Christian power had come in and conquered this territory, they viewed this in kind of a biblical way. Like, in fact, the language they'll use language like Ishmaelites, Saracens, these biblical terms that harken back to the idea of the Israelites struggling with some, accursed people or people who were not in God's favor, fighting with them. These Old Testament battles are the basis for a lot of these ideas about holy war that the Christians had in the Middle Ages. So that was how they perceived the Arab conquest. That was the big problem with this new, ruling elite that dominated the peninsula, was they were not Christians. So Reconquest was the idea of restoring the Christian order. So whether or not it was actually the old Visigothic regime wasn't as important to them. For them, this was about Christian reconquest. So from that perspective, again, a lot of this is about perspective. I think we can easily see that the Reconquista was a reconquest. To summarize here, was the Reconquest of Spain actually a reconquest? I think the important thing is that from the perspective of the Christians, it certainly was. And if you want to understand this period, if you're studying this period, you do have to take that into account. And so that's why the concept of Reconquista is a very valid framework and approach when studying the history of medieval Spain. One aspect of it, right? It's one aspect, but it's a very important aspect, and it's something that does have to be understood. If you ignore it or try to pretend that it's not there, I think you're just going to miss many crucial aspects of the entire period, and you're going to have to do a lot of ignoring. You're going to have to really interpret the sources and ignore a lot of stuff in the source material, because this is the way it was understood by the people involved. So there's that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Just a quick announcement. I'm actually doing a bit of a partnership on Real Crusades history with somebody who does animation, who's very good with visuals, a guy who's been providing some video game footage for me, Alexander Knight. He mentioned to me recently, he said, hey, you know, I know you've been wanting to get more animated maps in your videos. If you want to do that, I could do that for you. And I said, you know, I do want to do that. I have been in some ways dreading having to learn the software to do that. I'm not as much, you know, an animator type guy in that way. So yeah, I would love to have you do that. In fact, here's an idea. What if you and I collaborated and you created the entire visual presentation? You could kind of, you know, do that, and then I could, you know, continue to do the research and the narration and that sort of thing. Let's try that out. Let's collaborate on some videos in that way. And he said, yeah, that's great. So we'll see how that goes. You know, Alexander's a great guy. He's very talented. So Alexander Knight's going to be helping me with some videos. Say hi to him. And he also made a request that I asked some of you guys what sort of visuals you would like to see, stuff that you think would be helpful. Let him know in the comments below. Take care, guys. I'll talk to you soon.